Welcome, I'm Daisy, your hostess. In this video, Plotinus the Greek philosopher will walk us through a labyrinth of words in his treatise titled Nature, Contemplation, and the One. If you're looking for answers about that first cause, this treatise may get you closer to what you want to know. So before I get started, by way of housekeeping, there are a couple things I'd like to share with you. Otherwise, feel free to grab the jump link in the description of this video and jump forward. If you just found me at this video, make sure to visit my playlist and grab the previous chapters. And to my family, friends, and subscribers, thank you for being part of my community. Now, by reading this treatise and the frequency that Plato is mentioned, specific works such as the Phaedrus and the Timaeus, which, by the way, I have the Timaeus in my playlist. Make sure to check it out. Now, one can see the influence that Plato, who lived around 428 BC to 348 BC, had over Plotinus, who today is considered the founder of Neoplatonism. Just like many theology scholars interpret the Bible, Plotinus interpreted Plato's works. Plotinus was alive from about 204 CE or Anno Domini to 270 CE, whichever one you prefer, and there's approximately a 500-year between their deaths, between that of Plato and Plotinus. Now, you know, time is a funny thing, and also what happens in between that space of time. That gap from Plato to Plotinus in that part of the world harbored the decline of the Greek god worship, the life and death of Jesus, the rise of Christianity, which was born within that 500-year gap of that old Greco-Roman culture, and it was influenced from the then 400-year-old Plotinus tradition. You don't have to take it from me. Open a Christian Bible and you will catch those references, like especially of the mentions of Greek gods, including Zeus, Hermes, Artemis, and Dioscuri. These are mentioned primarily in the New Testament in the book of Acts. And then add to that the early Jewish messianism and the political tensions, plus Emperor Constantine pronouncing the Edict of Milan in 313, which lifted the repressive laws of his predecessor Diocletian, and there you have it. A new religion is born. And it would not be unlikely that many of its religious leaders would be influenced by Plotinus's Neoplatonic philosophy. One example was Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who himself was a pagan Neoplatonist, known for his mystical theology and his emphasis on the transcendent nature of God. He was converted to Christianity in Athens by the disciple Paul around 50 to 60 CE, Anno Domini. That's approximately 25 years after Jesus' death. As I've mentioned before, things just don't happen overnight. And clearly, Plotinus is an example that we do stand on the shoulders of those that came before us. The Enneads is something to sit with in little pieces. In parts, I was able to follow the maze laid out by Plotinus and reached many moments of wonder, realizing that it was from the works of Plato that the foundations came from. Plato was the first to write that God was indivisible, a concept later echoed in Christian theology. God is unchanging and cannot be divided into parts. Then in Plato's theory of forms, he postulates that the physical world we perceive through our senses is not the ultimate reality. He adds that all the forms of authentic existence spring from vision and are a vision. I wonder if that was the beginning of understanding that all is mind. And what would a conversation sound like between Plato and today's scientists who claim we live in a simulation? And for those of you who are attracted to the world of seership and divination, I thought the topic on the charioteer was intriguing. It was a small little section, as it reminded me of the major arcana of the tarot. The thing is, tarot made its appearance around the 1500s. That's way, way after Plato, or Plotinus for that matter. Apparently, as per Plotinus' rendering, where he's talking about Plato in the Phaedrus myth mentioned, the charioteer as the leading principle of the soul. And Plato goes on to describe the two horses representing two dissonant faculties, and that was a vision and an object of vision, all having to do with craving and taking action, or moving towards the object of desire. What I find amusing is that the chariot usually depicts a charioteer and two beasts, one black and one white, just like Plato's dissonant faculties, and the card is normally interpreted to mean overcoming conflicts and moving forward in a positive direction. Interesting again, the movement towards something desired. I mention this also to bring up how everything seems to connect and finding original sources, or how did something come about, asking those questions. Sometimes it can get a bit tricky. Even with the tarot cards, which originally were used just as regular playing cards, eventually, like out of nowhere, they evolved into a divination tool. Let us circle back to Plotinus' Enneads. As he ventures into this third Ennead, he's exploring the interconnectedness of the natural world, the act of contemplation, and arriving at the One as the ultimate principle, beyond all being and thought, and the goal of both nature's emanation and the soul's contemplative journey is to return to this unity. I do hope you enjoy it. I look forward to your comments. Now that's a wrap for my intro. Let's turn the page. The Enneads by Plotinus, translated from Greek by Stephen McKenna. Third Ennead, 8th Tractate. Nature, Contemplation, and the One. 1. Supposing we played a little before entering upon our serious concern and maintained that all things are striving after contemplation, looking to vision as their one end. And this not merely beings endowed with reason, but even the unreasoning animals, the principle that rules in growing things, and the earth that produces these, and that all achieve their purpose in the measure possible to their kind, each attaining vision and possessing itself of the end in its own way and degree. Some things in entire reality, others in mimicry and in image. We would scarcely find anyone to endure so strange a thesis. But in a discussion entirely among ourselves, there is no risk in a light handling of our own ideas. Well, in the play of this very moment, am I engaged in the act of contemplation? Yes, I and all that enter this play are in contemplation. Our play aims at vision, and there is every reason to believe that child or man, in sport or earnest, is playing or working only towards vision. That every act is an effort towards vision. The compulsory act, which tends rather to bring the vision down to outward things, and the act thought of as voluntary, less concerned with the outer, originate alike in the effort towards vision. The case of man will be treated later on. Let us speak first of the earth and of the trees and vegetation in general, asking ourselves what is the nature of contemplation in them, how we relate to any contemplative activity, the labor and productiveness of the earth, how nature, held to be devoid of reason and even of conscious representation, can either harbor contemplation or produce by means of the contemplation which it does not possess. 2. There is obviously no question here of hands or feet, of any implement borrowed or inherent. Nature needs simply the matter which it is to work upon and bring under form. Its productivity cannot depend upon mechanical operation. What driving or hoisting goes to produce all that variety of color and pattern? The wax workers whose methods have been cited as parallel to creative act of nature are enabled to make colors. All they can do is to impose upon their handicraft colors taken from elsewhere. Nonetheless, there is a parallel which demands attention. In the case of workers in such arts, there must be something locked up within themselves, an efficacy not going out from them and yet guiding their hands in all their creation. And this observation should have indicated a similar phenomena in nature. It should be clear that this indwelling efficacy, which makes without hands, must exist in nature, no less than in craftsmen, but there as a thing completely inbound. Nature need possess no outgoing force as against that remaining within. The only moved thing is matter. There can be no moved phase in this nature principle. Any such moved phase could not be the primal mover. This nature principle is no such moved entity. It is the unmoved principle operating in the cosmos. We may be answered that the reason principle is no doubt unmoved, but that the nature principle, another being, operates by motion. But if nature entire is in question here, it is identical with the reason principle, and any part of it that is unmoved is the reason principle. The nature principle must be an ideal form, not a compound of form and matter. There is no need for it to possess such a changeable element as matter, hot and cold. The matter that underlies it, on which it exercises its creative act, brings all that with it, or natively without quality, becomes hot and cold, and all the rest, when brought under reason, matter, to become fire, demands the approach not of fire, but of a reason principle. This is no slight evidence that in the animal and vegetable realms the reason principles are the makers, and that nature is a reason principle producing a second reason principle, its offspring, which in turn, while itself still remaining intact, communicates something to the underlying matter. The reason principle presiding over visible shape is the very ultimate of its order, a dead thing unable to produce further. That which produces in the created realm is the living reason principle, brother, no doubt, to that which gives mere shape, but having life-giving power. 3. But if this reason principle, nature, is an act and produces by the process indicated, how can it have any part in contemplation? To begin with, since in all its production it is stationary and intact, a reason principle self-indwelling, it is in its own nature a contemplative act. All doing must be guided by an idea, and will therefore be distinct from that idea. The reason principle then, as accompanying and guiding the work, will be distinct from the work, not being action, but reason principle it is, necessarily contemplation. Taking the reason principle, the logos, in all its phases, the lowest and last springs from a mental act in the higher logos, and is itself a contemplation, though only in the sense of being contemplated, i.e., of being object and not subject. But above it stands the total logos with its two distinguishable phases, first that identified not as nature but as all soul, and next that operating in nature and being itself the nature principle. And does this reason principle, nature, spring from a contemplation? Wholly and solely. From self-contemplation, then? Or what are we to think? It derives from a contemplation and some contemplating being? How are we to suppose it to have contemplation itself? The contemplation springing from the reasoning faculty that, of planning its own content, it does not possess. But why not, since it is a phase of life, a reason principle, and a creative power? Because to plan for a thing is to lack it. Nature does not lack. It creates because it possesses. Its creative act is simply its possession of its own characteristics, essence. Now, its essence, since it is a reason principle, is the content at once an act of contemplation and an object of contemplation. In other words, the nature principle produces by virtue of being an act of contemplation, an object of contemplation, and a reason principle. On this triple character depends its creative efficacy. Thus, the act of production is seen to be in nature an act of contemplation, for creation is the outcome of a contemplation which never becomes anything else, which never does anything else, but creates by simply being a contemplation. 4. And nature, asked why it brings forth its works, might answer if it cared to listen and to speak. it would have been more becoming to put no question, but to learn in silence, just as I myself am silent and make no habit of talking. And what is your lesson? This, that whatsoever comes into being is my vision, seen in my silence, the vision that belongs to my character who sprung from vision, and vision loving, and create vision by the vision seeing faculty within me. The mathematicians from their vision draw their figures, but I draw nothing. I gaze, and the figures of the material world take being as if they fell from my contemplation. As with my mother, the old soul, and the beings that begot me, so it is with me. They are born of a contemplation, and my birth is from them, not by their act, but by their being. They are the loftier reason principles. They contemplate themselves, and I am born. Now what does this tell us? It tells that what we know as nature is a soul, offspring of a yet earlier soul of more powerful life, that it possesses, therefore, in its repose, a vision within itself, that it has no tendency upward, nor even downward, but is at peace, steadfast in its own essence, that in this immutability accompanied by what may be called self-consciousness, it possesses, within the measure of its possibility, a knowledge of the realm of subsequent things perceived in virtue of that understanding and consciousness, and, achieving thus a resplendent and delicious spectacle, has no further aim. Of course, while it may be convenient to speak of understanding or perception in the nature principle, this is not in the full sense applicable to other beings. We are applying to sleep a word borrowed from the wake. For the vision on which nature broods inactive is a self-intuition, a spectacle laid before it by virtue of its unaccompanied self-concentration, and by the fact that in itself it belongs to the order of intuition. It is a vision, silent but somewhat blurred, for there exists another, a clearer, of which nature is the image. Hence all that nature produces is weak. The weaker act of intuition produces the weaker object. In the same way, human beings, when weak on the side of contemplation, find in action their trace of vision and of reason. Their spiritual feebleness unfits them for contemplation. They are left with a void because they cannot adequately seize the vision, yet they long for it. They are hurried into action as their way to the vision which they cannot attain by intellection. They act from the desire of seeing their action and making it visible and sensible to others, when the result shall prove fairly well equal to the plan. Everywhere, doing and making will be found to be either an attenuation or a complement of vision attenuation if the doer was aiming only at the thing done. Complement if he is to possess something nobler to gaze upon than the mere work produced. Given the power to contemplate the authentic, who would run of choice after its image? The relation of action to contemplation is indicated in the way duller children, inapt to study and speculation, take the crafts and manual labor. 5. This discussion of nature has shown us how the origin of things is a contemplation. We may now take the matter up to the higher soul. We find that the contemplation pursued by this, its instinct towards knowing and inquiring, the birth pangs set up by the knowledge it attains, its teeming fullness, have caused it, in itself all one object of vision, to produce another vision, that of the cosmos. It is just as a given science, complete in itself, becomes the source and cause of what might be called a minor science in the student who attains to some partial knowledge of all its divisions. But the visible objects and the objects of intellectual contemplation of this later creation helpless by the side of the content of the soul. The primal phase of the soul, inhabitant of the Supreme, and by its participation in the Supreme, filled and illuminated, remains unchangeable there, but in virtue of that first participation, that of the primal participant, a secondary phase also participates in the supreme, and this secondary goes for ceaselessly as life streaming from life. For energy runs through the universe, and there is no extremity at which it dwindles out. But travel as far as it may, it never draws that first part of itself from the place whence that outgoing began. For if it abandoned its prior, the intellectual principle, it would no longer be everywhere. Its continuous being would be broken, and it would be present at the end only of its course. Nonetheless, that which goes forth cannot be equal to that which remains. Then, the soul is to extend throughout the universe, no spot void of its energy, but a prior is always different from its secondary, and energy is a secondary, rising as it must from contemplation or act. Act, however, is not at this stage existent, since it depends upon contemplation. Therefore, the soul, while its phases differ, must in all of them remain a contemplation, and what seems to be an act done under contemplation must be in reality that weakened contemplation of which we have spoken. The engendered must respect the kind, but in weaker form, dwindled in the descent. All goes softly, since nothing here demands the parade of thought or act upon external things. It is a soul in vision, and by this vision, creating its own subsequent, this principle of nature, itself also contemplative, but in the feebler degree, since it lies further away and cannot reproduce the quality or experiences of its prior. A vision creates the vision. Such creative contemplation is not inexplicable, for no limit exists either to contemplation or to its possible objects. And this explains how the soul is universal. Where can this thing fail to be, which is one identical thing in every soul? Vision is not cabined within the bournes of magnitude. This, of course, does not mean that the soul is present at the same strength in each and every place and thing, any more than that it is at the same strength in each of its own phases. The charioteer, the leading principle of the soul in the Phaedrus myth, gives the two horses its two dissonant faculties. What he has seen, and they, taking that gift, showed that they were hungry for what made that vision. There was something lacking to them. If in their desire they acted, their action aimed at what they craved for, and that was vision, and an object of vision. Action thus is set towards contemplation and an object of contemplation, so that even those whose life is in doing have seeing as their object. What they have not been able to achieve by the direct path, they hope to come at by the circuit. Further, suppose they succeed. They desired a certain thing to come about, not in order to be unaware of it, but to know it, to see it present before the mind. Their success is the laying up of a vision. We act for the sake of some good. This means not for something to remain outside ourselves, not in order that we may possess nothing, but that we may hold the good of the action. And hold it where? Where but in the mind? Thus, once more, action is brought back to contemplation, for mind or soul is a reason principle, and that one lays up in the soul can be no other than a reason principle, a silent thing. The more certainly such a principle as the impression made is the deeper. The vision achieved, the acting instinct pauses, the mind is satisfied and seeks nothing further. The contemplation, in one so conditioned, remains absorbed within as having acquired certainty to rest upon. The brighter the certainty, the more tranquil is the contemplation as having acquired the more perfect unity. And for now we come to the serious treatment of the subject. In proportion to the truth in which the knowing faculty knows, it comes to identification with the object of its knowledge. It persists, the two lie apart, parallel as it were to each other. There is a pair in which the two elements remain strange to one another, as when ideal principles laid up in the mind or soul remain idle. Hence the idea must not be left to lie outside, but must be made one identical thing with the soul of the novice so that he finds it really his own. Once domiciled within that idea and brought to likeness with it, becomes productive, active, What it always held by its primary nature, it now grasps with knowledge and applies indeed, so becoming, as it were, a new thing, and informed as it is now is by the purely intellectual. It sees, in its outgoing act, as a stranger looking upon a strange world. It was no doubt essentially a reason principle, even an intellectual principle, but its function to see a lower realm which these do not see. For it is not a complete thing. It has a lack. It is incomplete in regard to its prior. Yet it also has a tranquil vision of what it produces. What it has once brought into being, it produces no more. For all its productiveness is determined by this lack. It produces for the purpose of contemplation, in the desire of knowing all its content. When there is question of practical things, it adapts its content to the outside order. The soul has a greater content than nature has, and therefore it is more tranquil. It is more nearly complete, and therefore more contemplative. It is, however, not perfect, and is all the more eager to penetrate the object of contemplation, and it seeks the vision that comes by observation. It leaves its native realm and busies itself elsewhere. Then it returns, and it possesses its vision by means of that phase of itself from which it had parted. The self-indwelling soul inclines less to such experiences. The sage, then, has gone through a process of reasoning when he expounds his act to others, but in relation to himself he is vision. Such a man is already set, not merely in regard to exterior things, but also within himself, towards what is one and at rest. All his faculty in life are inward bent. 7. Certain principles, then, we may take to be established, some self-evident, others brought out by our treatment above. All the forms of authentic existence spring from vision and are vision. Everything that springs from these authentic existences in their vision is an object of vision, manifest to sensation or to true knowledge or to surface awareness. All act aims at this knowing, all impulses towards knowledge. All that springs from vision exists to produce ideal form. That is a fresh object of vision, so that universally, as images of their engendering principles, they all produce objects of vision, ideal forms. In the engendering of these sub-existences, imitations of the authentic, it is made manifest that the creating powers operate not for the sake of creation and action, but in order to produce an object of vision. This same vision is the ultimate purpose of all the acts of the mind, even further downward, of all sensation, since sensation also is an effort toward knowledge. Lower still, nature, producing similarly its subsequent principle, brings into being the vision and idea that we know in it. It is certain also that as the first exists in vision, all other things must be straining towards the same condition. The starting point is, universally, the goal. When living things reproduce their kind, it is that the reason principle within stir them. The procreative act is the expression of a contemplation, a travail towards the creation of many forms, many objects of contemplation, so that the universe may be filled full with reason principles, and that contemplation may be, as nearly as possible, endless. To bring anything into being is to produce an idea of form, and that again is to enrich the universe with contemplation. All the failures alike in being and in doing are but the swerving of visionaries from the object of vision. In the end, the sorriest craftsman is still a maker of forms, ungracefully. So love, too, is vision with the pursuit of ideal form. 8. From this basis we proceed. In the advancing stages of contemplation, rising from that in nature to that in the soul, and thence again to that in the intellectual principle itself, the object contemplated becomes progressively a more and more intimate possession of the contemplating beings, more and more one with them, and in the advanced soul the objects of knowledge, well on the way towards the intellectual principle, are close to identity with their container. Hence we may conclude that in the intellectual principle itself there is complete identity of knower and known, and this not by way of domiciliation, as in the case of even the highest soul, but by essence, by the fact that there no distinction exists between being and knowing. We cannot stop at a principle containing separate parts. There must always be a yet higher, a principle above all such diversity. The Supreme must be an entity in which the two are one. It will therefore be a seeing that lives, not an object of vision like things existing in something other than themselves. What exists in an outside element, in some mode of living thing, it is not the self-living. If therefore the pure object of intellection or contemplation is to have life, it must be life absolute and distinct from the vegetative or sensitive life or any other life determined by soul. In a certain sense, no doubt all lives are thoughts, but qualified as thought vegetative, thought sensitive, and thought psychic. What then makes them thoughts? The fact that they are reason principles. Every life is some form of thought, but of a dwindling clearness like the degrees of life itself. The first and clearest life and the first intelligence are one being. The first life, then, is an intellection, and the next form of life is the next intellection, and the last form of life is the last form of intellection. Thus every life is of this order. It is an intellection. But while men may recognize grades in life, they reject grades in thought. To them there are thoughts, full and perfect, and anything else is no thought. This is simply because they do not seek to establish what life is. The essential is to observe that here again, all reasoning shows that whatever exists is a bywork of visioning. If, then, the truest life is such by virtue of an intellection and is identical with the truest intellection, then the truest intellection is a living being. Contemplation and its object constitute a living thing, a life, two inextricably one. Is a unity, but how is this unity also a plurality? The explanation is that in a unity there can be no seeing. A pure unity has no room for vision and an object, and in its contemplation the one is not acting as a unity. If it were, the intellectual principle cannot exist. The highest began as a unity, but did not remain as it began. All unknown to itself, it became manifold. It grew, as it were, pregnant, desiring universal possession. It flung itself outward, though it were better had it never known the desire by which a secondary came into being. It is like a circle in the idea, which in projection becomes a figure, a surface, a circumference, a center, a system of radii, of upper and lower segments. The whence is the better, the whither is less good. The whence is not the same as the whence followed by a whither. The whence all alone is greater than with the whither added to it. The intellectual principle, on the other hand, was never merely the principle of an inviolable unity. It was a universal as well, and being so, was the intellectual principle of all things. Being thus all things and the principle of all, it must be such that every part of it is universal things. Otherwise, it contains a part which is not intellectual principle. It will be a juxtaposition of non-intellectuals, a huddled heap waiting to be made over from the mass of things into the intellectual principle. We conclude that this being is limitless, and that in all the outflow from it there is no lessening, either in its emanation, since this is also the entire universe, nor in itself the starting point, since it is no assemblage of parts to be diminished by any outgo. 9. Clearly, a being of this nature is not the primal existent. There must exist that which transcends it, that being, the absolute, to which all our discussion has been leading. In the first place, plurality is later than unity. The intellectual principle is a number, the expression of a plurality, and number derives from unity. The source of a number such as this must be the authentically one. Further, It is the sum of an intellectual being with the object of its intellection, so that it is a duality. And given this duality, we must find what exists before it. What is this? The intellectual principle taken separately, perhaps? No. An intellect is always inseparable from an intelligible object. Eliminate the intelligible and the intellectual principle disappears with it. And what we are seeking cannot be the intellectual principle, but must be something that rejects the duality there present. Then the prior demanded by the duality must be something on the further side of the intellectual principle. But might it not be the intelligible object itself? No, for the intelligible makes an equally inseparable duality with the intellectual principle. If then neither the intellectual principle nor the intelligible object can be the first existent, what is it? Our answer can only be the source of both. What will this be? Under what character can we picture it? We will be told that it must be either intellective or without intellection. If intellective, it is the intellectual principle. If not, it will be without even a knowledge of itself. And then, what is there so august about it? If we define it as the good and the wholly complex, we will no doubt be telling the truth, but we will not be giving any certain and lucid account of it as long as we have in mind no entity in which to lodge the conception by which we define it. Yet, our knowledge of everything else comes by way of our intelligence. Our power is that of knowing the intelligible by means of the intelligence. But this entity transcends all of the intellectual nature. By what direct intuition, then, can it be brought within our grasp? To this question, the answer is that we can know it only in the degree of human faculty. We indicate it by virtue of what in ourselves is like it. For in us also there is something of that being. Nay, nothing ripe for that participation can be void of it. Wherever you be, you have only to range over against this omnipresent being that in you, which is capable of drawing from it, and you have your share in it. Imagine a voice sounding over a vast waste of land, and not only over the emptiness alone, but over human beings. Wherever you be in the great space, you have but to listen, and you take the voice entire, though yet with a difference. And what do we take when we thus point the intelligence? The intellectual principle in us must mount to its origins, essentially a thing facing two ways. It must deliver itself over to those powers within it which tend upward. If it seeks the vision of that being, it must become something more than intellect. For the intellectual principle is the earliest form of life. It is the activity presiding over the outflowing of the universal order. The outflow, that is, of the first moment, not that of the continuous process. In its character as life, as emanation, as containing all things in their precise forms and not merely in the agglomerate mass, for this would be to contain them, against its specific character, imperfectly and inarticulately, it must of necessity derive from some other being, from one that does not emanate, but is the principle of emanation, of life, of intellect, and of the universe. For the universe is not a principle and source, it springs from a source, and that source cannot be the all, or anything belonging to the all, since it is to generate the all, and must be not a plurality, but the source of plurality, since universally a begetting power is less complex than the begotten. Thus, in the being that has engendered the intellectual principle must be more simplex than the intellectual principle. We may be told that this engendering principle is the one and all, but at that, it must be either each separate entity from among all, or it will be all things in the one mass. Now, if we were the mass total of all, it must be of later origin than any of the things of which it is the sum. If it precedes the total, It differs from the things that make up the total and they from it. If it and the total of things constitute a coexistence, it is not a source. But what we are probing for must be a source. It must exist before all, that all may be fashioned as sequel to it. As for the notion that it may be each separate entity of the all, this would make a self-identity into a what you like, where you like, indifferently, and would besides abolish all distinction in things themselves. Once more we see that this can be no thing among things, but must be prior to all things. 10. And what will such a principle essentially be? The potentiality of the universe, the potentiality whose non-existence would mean the non-existence of all the universe and even of the intellectual principle, which is the primal life and all life. The principle on the thither side of life is the cause of life, for that manifestation of life, which is the universe of things, is not the first activity. It is itself poured forth, so to speak, like a water from a spring. Imagine a spring that has no source outside itself. It gives itself to all the rivers, yet is never exhausted by what they take, but remains always integrally as it was. The tides that proceed from it are at one with it before they run their several ways, yet all, in some sense, know beforehand down what channels they will pour their streams. Or, think of the life coursing throughout some mighty tree, while yet it is the stationary principle of the whole, in no sense scattered over all the extent, but, as it were, vested in the root. It is the giver of the entire and manifold life of the tree, but remains unmoved itself, not manifold, but the principle of that manifold itself. And this surprises no one, though it is in fact astonishing how all that varied vitality springs from the unvarying, and how that very manifoldness could not be unless before the multiplicity there were something all singleness. For the principle is not broken into parts to make the total. On the contrary, such partition would destroy both. Nothing would come into being if its cause, thus broken, changed character. Thus we are always brought back to the one. Every particular thing has a one of its own to which it may be traced. The all has its one, its prior, but not yet the absolute one. Through this we reach that absolute one, where all such reference comes to an end. Now when we reach a one, the stationary principle, in the tree, in the animal, in soul, in the all, we have in every case the most powerful, the precious element. When we come to the one in the authentically existent beings, their principle and source and potentiality, shall we lose confidence and suspect it of being nothing? Certainly this absolute is none of the things of which it is the source. Its nature is that nothing can be affirmed of it, not existence, not essence, not life, since it is that which transcends all these. But possess yourself of it by the very elimination of being, and you hold a marvel. Thrusting forward to this, attaining and resting in its content, seek to grasp it more and more, understanding it by that intuitive thrust alone, by knowing its greatness, by the beings that follow upon it and exist by its power. 11. Another approach. The intellectual principle is a seeing, and a seeing which itself sees. Therefore, it is a potentiality which has become effective. This implies the distinction of matter and form in it, and there must be in all actual seeing, the matter in this case being the intelligibles which the intellectual principle contains and sees. All actual seeing implies duality. Before the seeing takes place, there is the pure unity of the power of seeing. That unity of principle acquires duality in the act of seeing, and the duality is always to be traced back to a unity. Now, as our sight requires the world of sense for its satisfaction and realization, so the vision of the intellectual principle demands for its completion the good. It cannot be itself the good, since then it would not need to see or to perform any other act. For the good is the center of all else, and it is by means of the good that everything has act, while the good is in need of nothing and therefore possesses nothing beyond itself. Once you have uttered the good, add no further thought. By any addition, and in proportion to that addition, you introduce a deficiency. Do not even say that it has intellection. You would be dividing it. It would become a duality, intellect and the good. The good has no need of the intellectual principle, which on the contrary needs it, and attaining it is shaped into goodness and becomes perfect by it. The form thus received, sprung from the good, brings it to likeness with the good. Thus the traces of the good discerned upon it must be taken as indication of the nature of that archetype. We form a conception of its true character from its image playing upon the intellectual principle. This image of itself it has communicated to the intellect that contemplates it. Thus all the striving is on the side of the intellect, which is the eternal striver and eternally the attainer. The being beyond neither strives, since it feels no lack, nor attains, since it has no striving, and this marks it off from the intellectual principle, to which characteristically belongs the striving, the concentrated strain towards its form. Yet the intellectual principle, beautiful, the most beautiful of all, lying lapped in pure light and in clear radiance, circumscribing the nature of the authentic existence, the original of which this beautiful world is a shadow and an image, tranquil in the fullness of glory, since in it there is nothing devoid of intellect, nothing dark or out of rule, a living thing in a life of blessedness. This, too, must overwhelm with awe any that has seen it, and penetrate it, to become a unit of its being. But, as one that looks up to the heavens and sees the splendor of the stars, thinks of the Maker and searches, so whoever has contemplated the intellectual universe and known it and wondered for it must search after its Maker too. What being has raised so noble a fabric? And where? And how? Who has begotten such a child, this intellectual principle, this lovely abundance so abundantly endowed? The source of all this cannot be an intellect, nor can it be an abundant power. It must have been before intellect and abundance were. These are later in things of lack. Abundance had to be made abundant, and intellection needed to know. These are very near to the unneeding, to that which has no need of knowing. They have abundance and intellection authentically, as being the first to possess. But there is that before them which neither needs nor possesses anything, since needing or possessing anything else, it would not be what it is, the good. End of the 8th tractate on the Third Ennead by Plotinus. Stay right here on this video. We're going to move on to the 9th tractate, Detached Considerations. 1. The intellectual principle, the divine mind, we read in the Timaeus, looks upon the ideas indwelling in that being which is the essentially living, according to Plotinus, the intellectual realm. And then the text proceeds. The Creator judged that all the content of that essentially living being must find place in this lower universe also. Are we meant to gather that the ideas came into being before the intellectual principle so that it sees them as previously existent? The first step is to make sure whether the living being of the text is to be distinguished from the intellectual principle as another thing than it. It might be argued that the intellectual principle is the contemplator, and therefore that the living being contemplated is not the intellectual principle, but must be described as the intellectual object, so that the intellectual principle must possess the ideal realm as something outside of itself. But this would mean that it possesses images and not the realities, since the realities are in the intellectual realm which it contemplates. Reality, we read, is in the authentic existent which contains the essential form of the particular things. No, even though the intellectual principle and the intellectual object are distinct, they are not apart except for just that distinction. Nothing in the statement cited is inconsistent with the conception that these two constitute one substance, though in a unity admitting that distinction of the intellectual act as against passivity, without which there can be no question of an intellectual principle and an intellectual object. What is meant is not that the contemplatory being possesses its vision as in some other principle, but that it contains the intellectual realm within itself. The intelligible object is the intellectual principle itself in its repose, unity, immobility. The intellectual principle, contemplator of that object, of the intellectual principle thus in repose, is an active manifestation of the same being, an act which contemplates its unmoved phase and, as thus contemplating, stands as intellectual principle to that of which it has the intellection. It is intellectual principle in virtue of having that intellection, and at the same time is intellectual object by assimilation. This then is the being which planned to create in the lower universe when it saw existing in the supreme the four orders of living beings. No doubt the passage of the Timaeus seems to imply tacitly that this planning principle is distinct from the other two, but the three, the essentially living, the intellectual principle, and this planning principle, will to others be manifestly one. The truth is that by a common accident, a particular trend of thought has occasioned the discrimination. We have dealt with the first two, but the third, this principle which decides to work upon the objects, the ideas contemplated by the intellectual principle within the essentially living, to create them, to establish them in their partial existence. What is this third? It is possible that in one aspect the intellectual principle is the principle of partial existence, while in another aspect it is not. The entities thus particularized from the unity are products of the intellectual principle, which thus would be, to that extent, the separating agent. On the other hand, it remains in itself indivisible. Division begins with its offspring, which of course means with souls, and thus a soul with its particular souls may be the separative principle. This is what is conveyed where we are told that the separation is the work of the third principle and begins within the third. For to this third belongs the discursive reasoning, which is no function of the intellectual principle, but characteristic of its secondary, of soul, to which precisely divided by its own kind belongs the act of division. 2. For in any one science, the reduction of the total of knowledge into its separate propositions does not shatter its unity, chipping it into unrelated fragments. In each distinct item is latent the entire body of the science, an integral thing in its highest principle and its last detail. And similarly, a man must so discipline himself that the first principles of his being are also his completions, are totals, that all be pointed towards the loftiest phase of the nature. When a man has become this unity in the best, he is in that other realm, for it is by this highest within himself, made his own, that he holds to the supreme. 3. At no point did the all-soul come into being. It never arrived, for it never knew place. What happens is that body, neighboring with it, participates in it. Hence Plato does not place soul in body, but body in soul. The others, the secondary souls, have a point of departure. They come from the all-soul. They have a place into which to descend and in which to change to and fro, a place thereof from which to ascend. But this all-soul is forever above, resting in that being in which it holds its existence as soul and followed as next by the universe, or at least by all beneath the sun. The partial soul is illuminated by moving towards the soul above it, for on that path it meets authentic existence. Movement towards the lower, it's towards non-being, and this is the step it takes when it is set on self. For by willing towards itself, it produces its lower, an image of itself, a non-being, and so is wandering, as it were, into the void, stripping itself of its own determined form. And this image, this undetermined thing, in blank darkness, for it is utterly without reason, untouched by the intellectual principle, far removed from authentic being. As long as it remains at the mid-stage, it is in its own peculiar region. But when, by a sort of inferior orientation, it looks downward, it shapes that lower image and flings itself joyfully thither. 4. How then does unity give rise to multiplicity? By its omnipresence. There is nowhere where it is not. It occupies, therefore, all that is. At once it is manifold, or rather, it is all things. If it were simply and solely everywhere, all would be this one thing alone, but it is also in no place, and this gives in the final result that while all exist by means of it, in virtue of its omnipresence, all is distinct from it in virtue of its being nowhere. But why is it not merely present everywhere, but in addition nowhere present? Because universality demands a previous unity. It must, therefore, pervade all things and make all, but not be the universe which it makes. 5. The soul itself must exist as seeing, with the intellectual principle as the object of its vision. It is undetermined before it sees, but is naturally apt to see. In other words, soul is matter to its determinant, the intellectual principle. 6. When we exercise intellection upon ourselves, we are obviously observing an intellective nature, for otherwise we would not be able to have that intellection. We know, and it is ourselves that we know, therefore we know that the reality of a knowing nature, therefore, before that intellection in act, there is another intellection, one at rest, so to speak. Similarly, that self-intellection is an act upon a reality and upon a life. Therefore, before the life and real being concerned in the intellection, there must be another being in life. In a word, intellection is vested in the activities themselves. Since then the activities of self-intellection are intellective forms, we, the authentic we, are the intelligibles, and self-intellection conveys the image of the intellectual sphere. 7. The primal is a potentiality of movement and of repose, and so is above and beyond both. Its next subsequent has rest and movement about the primal. Now this subsequent is the intellectual principle, so characterized by having intellectual of something not identical with itself, whereas the primal is without intellection. A knowing principle has duality, that entailed by being the knower of something, and, moreover, it knows itself as deficient, since its virtue consists in this knowing and not in its own bare being. 8. In the case of everything which has developed from possibility to actuality, the actual is that which remains self-identical for its entire duration, and this it is which makes perfection possible, even in things of the corporeal order, as for instance in fire. But the actual of this kind cannot be everlasting, since by the fact of their having once existed only in potentiality. Matter has its place in them. In anything, on the contrary, not composite, never touched by matter or potentiality, and possessing actuality, that actual existence is eternal. There is, however, a case also in which a thing itself existing in actuality stands as potentiality to some other form of being. 9. But the first is not to be envisaged as made up from gods of a transcendent order. No. The authentic existence constitute the intellectual principle in which motion and rest begin. The primal touches nothing, but it is the center around which those other beings lie in repose and in movement. For movement is aiming, and the primal aims at nothing. What could the summit aspire to? Has it even no intellection of itself? It possesses itself, and therefore is said in general terms to know itself. But intellection does not mean self-ownership. It means turning the gaze towards the primal. Now the act of intellection itself, the primal act, and there is therefore no place for any earlier one. The being projecting this act transcends the act, so that intellection is secondary to the being in which it resides. Intellection is not the transcendently venerable thing, neither intellection in general, nor even the intellection of the good. Apart from and over any intellection stands the good itself. The good, therefore, needs no consciousness. What sort of consciousness can be conceived in it? Consciousness of the good as existent or non-existent? If of existent good, that good exists before and without any such consciousness. If the act of consciousness produces that good, then the good was not previously in existence, and at once the very consciousness falls to the ground, since it is no longer consciousness of the good. But would not all this mean that the first does not even live? The first cannot be said to live, since it is the source of life. All that has life consciousness and life intellection is derivative. It observes itself in order, but that activity to become master of its being. And if it study itself, this can mean only that ignorance inheres in it, and that it is of its own nature lacking, and to be made perfect by intellection. All thinking and knowing must here be eliminated. The addition introduces deprivation and deficiency. And this is the end of the 9th tractate of the Third Ennead by Plotinus, translated by Stephen McKenna. If you haven't done so yet, please do hit that like button. Leave a comment, let me know you were here. If you have family or friends that enjoy philosophy, share this with them. We still have a few more Enneads left. Like I mentioned, these are groups of 9, and he has 6 of these. So I'm working diligently to try to bring these to you, and we'll have them all up here soon. Thank you for being a part of my community.